All right. Hello, lovely lovelies. So here we are in our second day of covering plants. So hopefully it's getting easier for you guys to navigate this. I'm hoping I can get this uploaded in a timely manner. So we'll see how that goes. Sorry about that. So let's go ahead and take a look at our warm up for today. As you're thinking about this, just like we would in class, go ahead and think about it and maybe jot down what you remember from the last lesson about the different groups and how we classify plants and essentially how we could distinguish them or how they're different from each other. Oh, I almost forgot. So I realized that yesterday I did not give a statistical fact, and I don't have Sophia here to remind me from second period. So here our statistical fact from yesterday. The 24th was cats have over 100 vocal cords. And then for today, the 25th, is 1 out of 8 letters written is an E. So there you go. As far as grumps and good things, my grump is that I'm struggling a little bit with just not really the technology of how to do this, but getting the Wi-Fi and everything working since I live out in the boonies. But my good thing is that we're kind of hopefully getting it figured out. So let's talk about our warm-up. So our 4 groups of plants, the way that they were separated, and there's a couple of ways that you could write this, but to me, this is the easiest way. So our first type were our non-vascular plants, which we know are also do not produce seeds. So they they lack vascular tissue, obviously based on their name, and they also produce no seeds or pollen. And they also don't produce flowers or fruit or any of the other things that we probably associate with plants. All right, and then we had our seedless vascular. So these are our non-seed plants that do have vascular tissue. So they possess vascular tissue, and we'll talk about the different tissues more in a couple of days. But they still produce no seeds or pollen. All right, and then we have our seed plants, and that falls into 2 categories. So we have gymnosperms. So these are going to be those that produce, they possess vascular tissue, and they also produce seeds and pollen. They do not produce flowers and fruit. So far, none of these produce flowers or fruit. And then our final category are angiosperms. So they possess vascular tissue. They produce seeds and pollen, as well as flowers and fruit. All right, so we'll get into this a little bit more today when we talk about our adaptations. So when we talk about the adaptations of land plants, just know that not all land plants have these adaptations, but many of them do. And so as we go through them, I'll try and point out to you which of these groups have the adaptation that we're talking about. All right, so again, we're looking at land plants. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. These are pictures from a hike that Diana and I and the dog did maybe a couple of years ago. So this is in the big thicket, and these things that I'm circling here, these are pitcher plants. So these are actually carnivorous plants, and they look like a little pitcher, and insects fall into them because they want to try and get the stuff that's inside, and they get digested by the enzymes inside these sections of the plant. So that is definitely an adaptation. In addition to that, What does that tell us about the soil here in the big thicket? Well, since we know that this, the reason why these plants are carnivorous is not because they use the insects that they consume for their glucose or their energy. They use it for nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur and some other things. And so that means that this is probably nitrogen and phosphorus poor soil. So anyhow, all right. So as far as the notes go, in order for us to talk about land plants, we need to kind of distinguish what that means. And so for us, what land plants means is essentially those organisms that aren't algae, but have a lot of the same traits as algae, except for they don't live their whole lives in the water. Or, yeah, that's basically it. And so this is based on work in paleobotany. And so if you've ever seen the movie Jurassic Park, you might have seen Dr. Ellie Sattler. She is a paleobotanist. And so that's an actual science. And so they look at fossils and other evidence to determine the history of the natural history of these living things, these plants. So when we're talking about land plants, we're talking about plants that are not algae. Now, to us, that's just plants, because we know that algae are protists. But if you'll recall, I think I've told you in the past that wasn't the case. They weren't categorized as protists. They were considered part of the plant kingdom. And so that idea of land plants being this separate category from the algae comes from that kind of historical context. Essentially, everything that is what we would consider to be a plant is a land plant. And then there's also, more formally, we can have what are terrestrial and aquatic plants. But aquatic plants are plants that live part of their, that are in the water but have the adaptations that are similar to land plants. So we're actually not going to really get into that distinction. If you're interested, I would be more than happy to talk to you about it. It's just kind of beyond the scope of this class. But anyhow, so the differences between these different land plants leads to their is tied to their different adaptations, because we know that algae, because it's in the water, the cells that do photosynthesis, they can be buoyant on those leaf-like structures, and so they can get closer to the sun by just floating. And so that's something that things that aren't in the water can't do. Also, in order for these guys to reproduce sexually, they can produce their gametes, and they can just move, either they can swim in the water or they can just move in the currents of the water. Whereas, again, these plants that don't live in the water, these plants are not going to be able to do that. And so there are some adaptations that allow them to overcome those challenges. Now, we'll see that some of these land plants, especially these here, and more specifically the bryophytes and mosses, are still going to require water for some aspects of their life cycle, but they don't require it for their entire life cycle like these algae do. All right, so before we talk about the differences, there are some similarities between algae and plants. And so those are listed here. They're eukaryotic, so they have a nucleus, they undergo photosynthesis. So if you'll recall, photosynthesis is where we have this formula, so carbon dioxide and water and light energy yields glucose and oxygen. And so that process is going to happen in algae and land plants, and they have a nucleus. They have the same types of chlorophyll, which is the pigment that allows them to carry out photosynthesis. They both use different types of carbohydrates in the form of starch to store those products. That glucose product is converted into more complex carbohydrates for storage. And then they both also have cell walls that are made out of the carbohydrate cellulose. So that's the ways that they're similar. All right, so some of the adaptations to live on land. So one of the big things, obviously, again, going back to our formula for photosynthesis, Obviously, if I'm writing it down a couple of times, it's something that I know that you need to know, maybe for your upcoming assessments. So your test is going to be on the 8th, and your quiz is going to be on the 6th. So if you don't have that on your calendar, because I'm struggling to get that updated, just so that you know, those are your upcoming assessments. You are going to have to know some of this stuff about photosynthesis over here, okay? So one of the things that you need to know is that in order for photosynthesis to take place, we need these things, right? These are the react and the light, obviously. So the leaves of the plant are the primary place where photosynthesis is going to take place. And so that's one of the places that we need to have water. And so the plant actually gets its water through its roots. So the roots pull the water up from the ground. But once it gets up to the leaves, it would not be an advantage for the plant for that water to just immediately evaporate out. So there's this waxy layer. So if we look, here's like if we were to just take a punch out of the leaf and blow it up, there's this waxy layer that's on the top surface. And even though you can't see it here, it's also on the bottom surface of the leaf. That's called the cuticle. And so it's waxy and it holds in that moisture. So it's watertight, basically. You can also see that just to visualize it. So you can see that these are shiny. And even when leaves aren't super shiny, they still have a cuticle, but I just picked these pictures because these are easy to see because it's so shiny. Also, you can see it because this water beads up, just like it would on wax or plastic, I guess. So this is another way to see that cuticle is there. Now, that means that the leaf can't absorb water. Okay, the absorption comes from the roots. So that might be something interesting that you may not have thought about in terms of leaves before. All right, so all of our plants, so all of these have a cuticle. Okay, now in addition to a cuticle, there's something else that is necessary. And so remember that it's not just this is the same picture we saw a minute ago. So it's not just water that's necessary. Remember, our reactants include carbon dioxide and water. And so the leaf, in order to carry out photosynthesis, it also needs to get carbon dioxide. And ultimately, it's going to have to release oxygen. And so on the bottom side of the leaf, remember, there's still this cuticle here. Okay. But there are some openings that exist. And so those openings are called stomata. They're only on the underside of the leaf. And that has to do with evaporation. So it's to minimize evaporation, because when this is open, when the stomata is open, water can also escape, which isn't great for the plant. So here you can see this picture here shows here's our open stomata, and what's exiting is water vapor, so that means it's a gas, and oxygen, and then what's coming in is carbon dioxide. Okay, and so that's just what we would see, because remember, in addition to light, we're going to need that here, but we're going to produce oxygen, which is going to need to be released. We don't want that to build up in our plant along with our glucose. Now, there are a couple pictures here that I think are nice. So this is a scanning electron micrograph that's been, this color's been added to it digitally. So this is a stomata that is closed. So this right here actually would be the stomata. And then this would be the stomata that is open. Now, what would cause the stomata to open and close? Well, there are these structures that are around the side of the stomata that are called guard cells. So these here are called the guard cells, and you can see them, they're actually labeled here, guard cells. And so that's these parts along the outside. The opening is the stoma or stomata. Stoma is singular, and stomata is plural. So the opening is the stoma, the cells around it are the guard cells, which kind of makes sense. It's guarding that opening. And so what happens is in this drawing down here at the bottom, these little dots represent water. So I don't know why they picked red, but I guess it's just because there's already so much blue stuff on here. But these little dots are the water. And so what's happening in this example is that there's water in the plant, okay, in these epidural cells here, and there's enough water that it can move into these guard cells, and it causes those guard cells to swell. And so it's almost like if you think about if you have something that was like this and then you added volume to it, it's going to push it against this part and this part. So it's going to push it open like that. Okay. Now, when there's not that much water available in the plant, it's more important that the plant not allow this water to escape because it needs the water to carry out photosynthesis. And so what happens is then that water will leave. See, you can see over here in these vacuoles of these guard cells, there's lots of water, and over here there's not so much. And so that water has left those guard cells, and so they shrink back down and close. And so that's part of what's going on with our guard cells. Okay, and so all of this is to help maintain homeostasis within the plant, and which is just kind of balancing how much water we need and how much water is available, and then also allowing for that gas exchange. So when photosynthesis is happening a lot, that can be something that the cell has to deal with is as it's bringing in oxygen, releasing oxygen and bringing in the carbon dioxide, that water can actually escape. So it's kind of a balancing act. So this is a really good example of homeostasis. All right, so in addition to, the stomata and the cuticle are both going to be present in all of these. Now, our next adaptation is going to be about the vascular system. So obviously, that's not a adaptation that our non-vascular plants have. So the vascular system is an adaptation of specialized tissues that allow for transport. Kind of like our vascular system. So we have our blood vessels that act as a vascular system. So these are going to do a very similar thing. And so there's two types of vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. And so the xylem brings water up through the roots. So that's what you see here. Water's coming up through the roots. And so we have xylem throughout the plant, from the roots all the way through the plant. Okay, so it's going up pretty much without fail. And then anything that's absorbed in the water can also be distributed through the xylem. So any nutrients that are here in the soil, like nitrogen and these other ones, can be distributed throughout the plant because of this vascular tissue. So that's an advantage that these plants have. Now the phloem, so one of the ways to remember that is the phloem, is going to bring the products of photosynthesis. And those products are food, or it might help you to remember it, to think about it like that. So food or photosynthesis product comes through the phloem. And so remember, photosynthesis is going to occur in the leaves primarily. There's a little bit that happens in other places, but primarily it's going to happen in the leaves. And so what's going to happen is it's going to come, that product's going to come through the leaves, and then it's going to go up to the parts of the plant that might be above the leaves, so like flowers and fruits. And then it's also going to move down into the roots for storage. And that's where we're going to get our starches. Even those plants that don't produce tubers like potatoes and stuff can still store large amounts of the starch in their roots. So phloem doesn't just move down. I don't want you to think just down with phloem, because it can move throughout the plant. So since these plants have this ability to move things throughout the plant, they can grow much taller than those non-vascular plants. So one of the things that you should just maybe know about mosses and bryophytes is, actually we talked about when we did classification, they're really short. They're really small because all of that happens directly through the cell wall and through the cell membrane. And so they can't transport it throughout the body of the plant. They can only absorb directly. And so they just can't grow very big because of that limitation. So these plants have the ability to get much bigger. All right. So pollen. So if we're talking about pollen, right, then we are talking about plants that produce seeds. So that's going to be now these groups. So this is not going to include these two. Okay, these two do not have pollen. Okay. All right. All right. So pollen is the male gamete of plants. Okay. Inside the pollen, there are cells that divide and essentially produce sperm. So more or less, pollen is a plant sperm container. And so this is where we get to have fertilization without freestanding water. So the other two groups, the seedless vascular and the non-vascular, in order for fertilization to take place, they have to at some point have freestanding water. We have a whole lesson kind of about reproduction, and so we'll talk about how that happens. But everything that produces pollen does not require that. And so that's going to be both our gymnosperms and angiosperms, and that pollen can be carried by the wind. So you can see here, again, this is what's all over our vehicles. These are those male cones of the gymnosperms, and they can also be transported by animals, and we'll talk more about those pollinators here in a few minutes. And this is just a really close-up. I just love this picture of pollen grains. So they're super spiky, which makes me hate the fact that they might go in my nose. Okay, so everything that produces pollen produces seeds. And so let's talk a little bit about seeds. While you're home, if you want to take a bean and put it in a kind of moist, not dripping wet, but moist paper towel and watch it germinate, that's something that we would do in class. So if you want to do that, that would be awesome. I think it's fun, and I mean, we're all sitting here at home anyway, but if you don't have the time or inclination, I understand. So let's talk a little bit about seeds and how they act as an adaptation that allows for those land plants to be successful. So those plants that don't produce seeds, they have spores, and the spores are not very protected. So the first thing that seeds allow is it gives protection for the developing plant. And it doesn't have to be in the water. So when we were to look, if we were to look at a cross section of a seed, so if we were to cut it in half, and this is kind of like a bean, excuse me, if we were to cut it in half, you would see that there's this embryonic plant. It's just a baby plant inside there. And then all this part is stored food, carbohydrates, and proteins and lipids for the seed. And that part is called the cotyledon. And so those that have two of those are called dicotyledons, and those that have one are monocotyledons. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a future lesson. So here we have that little embryonic plant, and so it gives it some protection and allows for the storage while while the plant is waiting to be able to what's called germinate. All right, so let's look at the germination. So germination is essentially defined as when the seed goes from being a seed to a seedling. And so seedling is this right here. Okay, so at this point, it would no longer be considered a seed. Okay, that the germination will have been completed. So essentially this does require water, but it doesn't require standing water. So the water can just be absorbed through the surface of the plant, and then it also has to be the right temperature. And when that happens, the seed coat will rupture. That's what we see going from here to here. And then what will happen is you can see it right here. And then you can see it more here, is we'll get this seed root, which is called the radicle. And so you can also see it in this picture here. Okay. So then we have the shoot emerging. So that's this is called the plumule. And then I don't know why I put this here. This is wrong. And then what will be called the seed leaves will unfold. Okay, the cotyledon is this storage part. These are the seed leaves, and they're going to unfold. And you can see them here in this picture. So the seed leaves will unfold, and once that happens, germination is complete. Okay, so this is something that happens in all of our seed-bearing plants. Okay, now let's talk about dispersal of seeds. So in addition to having that protection and the biggest advantage to having those seeds and that protection is that it allows the seeds to move away from the parent plant. And so that increases the survivability of the offspring plants in these ways. So it reduces competition with the adult plants. Also, if there's a lot of adult plants in an area, then anything that's a predator or a pathogen, remember a pathogen's a disease, if any of those are present, they're going to be present near those adult plants. So it allows the offspring to move away from that to avoid those. And then it can allow for us to colonize new areas. Now, when we think of seed dispersal, excuse me, the key thing here is fruits. Okay, the part of the seed, the structure that allows the seed to be dispersed is the fruit. And so all of these, and all of these, and all of these, and all of these, and all of these are fruits. Okay, now for us, we probably only think about the ones that we eat, but all of these are actually considered fruits as long as the seeds are initially inside them. And so dispersal can happen through animals. Okay, so that's this here. So that can be through animals eating the fruits. It can be through the fruits attaching to the animal and moving around. So you guys might have seen these before. These also attach, they have the little hooks and they can attach to the animal. They can disperse through the wind. So you guys have seen these. These are the ones that when we always throw them in the air and they look like little helicopters when they fall down. The water can also distribute. So the fruit of the coconut allows it to be buoyant and then it can move via water. And then expulsion. If you have the inclination to look up a video, these are pretty interesting. So as the fruit dries on the plant, it actually it produces like a catapult, for lack of a better way to describe it, and it throws the fruit or throws the seeds out. Also, if you've ever seen a tumbleweed, that's what's happening with a tumbleweed is it's actually distributing seeds by rolling around. So it's pretty interesting, different ways. So these are all fruits. Okay, even though we don't think about them that way. All right, so those adaptations of fruits are ones that are only going to be present right in our angiosperms. Okay, now seed dispersal in our gymnosperms is basically through those cones. That's essentially how that works. Okay. Other adaptations of land plants. So these are just kind of a more broad kind of category that's not going through the succession of the different types of classifications like we were earlier. But there are adaptations that have to do with coevolution. And so there are fungi that have co-evolved with plants. They're called mycorrhiza, and they essentially extend the surface area of the roots of some plants to help with their success, and so that is an adaptation of them working together. Also, there's bacteria. So we talked about those root nodules that are present in some plants like legumes that allow for these nitrogen fixing bacteria to be present. And then we have a lot of coevolution adaptations that have to do with animals. And that's really twofold. Okay, so the first one, which I'm showing on the right, or sorry, on the left, is pollinators. So essentially the reason that flowers exist is to attract pollinators. Okay, and so you can see this is that coevolution that we talked about, where you have one organism adapting or developing an adaptation, and then the organism that is associated with it also having to adapt, and then it's just kind of continues going. So you can see here, so we have this fly that wants this nectar. Okay, well, the flower wants, we know, kind of, we're generalizing here, but the flower wants its pollen to be spread, and so it wants the fly to get closer into the flower. And so what happens is those flowers that have a deeper nectar tube, their pollen gets spread better than those that don't have that deeper nectar tube. And so those flowers are the ones that reproduce, and so we get more flowers over time. Okay, now what about the flies? Well, the flies, those that have this longer nose part, okay, it's called a proboscis, those that have a longer one are more likely to get nectar. And so if you're more likely to get nectar, you're more likely to survive. And so then you have offspring, and so we have a shift toward having that longer proboscis. Well, then as that happens, there's still variation there's still variation within these pollen tubes, or sorry, nectar tubes. And so those that have a still deeper nectar are more successful. And so it just continues and continues. So the flower evolves, the fly responds, and so we get these extravagant traits like you see here. So this is a type of flower that has this nectar tube that's way long, like the nectar's all the way down here. And so the proboscis of the fly has to go all the way down to that nectar. Okay, and so and then it collects its pollen here. And then this is another example where the pollen's collected here and the pollen's collected here. They're just different types, but all of these have this really long nectar tube, and that's due to that coevolution. Okay, now this also can happen with things that aren't insects. So there are pollinators that are bats and pollinators that are mammals. Some of them, there's just all kinds of cool stuff. You know, I could talk about it forever. All right, so that's adaptations that have to do with pollinators. And again, this is only going to be in those organisms that produce pollen. All right, and then how about in terms of defense? So it's a double-edged sword as far as the relationship of animals with plants, because especially those that produce pollen. So it's an advantage for the plant, for the pollinator to come in and distribute the pollen. But what if the animal isn't pollinating, but it's eating the plant? So obviously if the plant gets eaten, especially its leaves and its roots or its stem, then it can't survive. And so there are defenses that have evolved in plants to defend against that predator of animals. And so probably the one that you guys would be most familiar with is going to be anything that has spines or stuff like that on them. So this is from a raspberry vine. But obviously cacti, things like that, those are defensive adaptations against animals. Another type is this here. So this is a mimosa plant, and what it's doing is when it gets touched, and we're going to talk about this process when we talk about hormones in plants. When it gets touched, it causes these leaves to wilt down and look like this. And so then to any other animals that might come past it, they look sickly, or they just don't look like there's very much food there, and so they bypass them. And then there's lots of plants that produce a chemical defense. So this is foxglove, which is can be used as poison. And then I don't know how many of you have seen Harry Potter, but they have mandrakes. So this is actually from a picture from the 15th century. And you can see, like, it looks like there's a little person in there. This is supposed to be a mandrake because there are chemicals that mandrakes produce that can cause dysphoria. And so it's almost like it takes over. So it's that's why they kind of think about it as like there's this other human inside of it that takes over. So anyway, those are all defenses that have evolved in plants against animals. So obviously it can go a lot of ways. All right, so that's it. I know this one was a lot longer, but we covered a lot, and so hopefully that makes sense. I miss you guys, and I hope that everything is going well.